point out that we started a petition against the Scotia Pact over there on the little table, and I'm also selling t-shirts. If anybody order one or wants one, come and see me after. And I just want to say a few words today about our current situation and see what our governments are trying to do in our province and in our country. We have rights, and sadly many people have no idea what rights are being infringed on. Let's not forget, early August, Dr. Strangler said that Nova Scotia is in no rush to follow Quebec's lead and has not made any decision on vaccine passports. He says it will further marginalize populations that are already marginalized in our community. He thinks there are a number of issues concerning the idea and that any proof of vaccination would have to be robust to avoid fraudulent claims. Now, August 23rd, at a press conference, the first one with Houston, Dr. Strange says, your choice about vaccination needs to balance with equal responsibility to protect those around you. We are watching our epidemiology closely, and we will bring forward recommendations on vaccine policy if we feel that it was necessary or needed in Nova Scotia to keep them safe. So when Dr. Strange was asked about businesses can restrict admittance to individuals based on their vaccine status, his response was that he has been advising private businesses to ensure that what they decide to put in place does not discriminate against people or infringe on their rights. Anyone crafting their own policies should be aware of legal and human rights around those who cannot be vaccinated for medical reasons, only medical reasons, nothing else, since they need to be accommodated. Then he turns around and says, some organizations and governments require employees to be fully vaccinated and are granted access to certain services and activities based on vaccination status. What was that? What is that? Like, in the same breath, he's saying the opposite thing. So when he was asked about health passports, he said whatever system the federal government lands on for travelers throughout Canada and internationally could be used in Nova Scotia by businesses or organizations wanting to restrict the services to those who are fully vaccinated. So much for the legal and human rights he just mentioned, right? He also stated that the province is working with the federal government on what proof of vaccination would look like for Nova Scotians. So Dr. Strange says, log into the provincial website with your health card to get the proof of their vaccination status. He said they want people to be ready to have more ready access. He also says people who choose to be unvaccinated are going to have to go through extra measures to keep the rest of us safe. Now listen, this is coming from our Chief Health Medical Officer for Nova Scotia. Unbelievable. Now our new Premier, Tim Houston, says his government will not be issuing vaccine passports. But on September 1st, the Halifax Scotia Bank Centre wants proof of vaccination or a negative test for any event. So I asked Mr. Houston, how can this be different than having an actual vaccine passport? So therein lies the oxymoron. Vaccine passports will allow business owners, government officials, and just about everyone else to be treated like a second-class citizen and deny you access to everything from education, work, travel, recreation, social engagement, and daily commerce, all under the false guise of you being a biological threat to all those who have been vaccinated. Now, just to recap some of our rights, reasons why we're against the vaccine passport, and what we may be able to do about it. Because vaccine passports eliminate basic human rights. Section 6 of the Charter, mobility rights. Section 5 of Nova Scotia Human Rights Act under discrimination prohibits the effect of imposing burdens, obligations, or disadvantages on any individual or a class of individuals not imposed on or which withholds or limits to opportunities, benefits, and advantages available to other individuals or classes of individuals in society. The Emergency Act of 1988, the Governor and Council is taking such special temporary measures would be subject to the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms and the Canadian Bill of Rights and must have regard to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, particularly with respect to fundamental rights that are not to be limited or abridged even in a national emergency.
Preach it, Darlene.
In the Canadian National Report on Immunization, it says, immunization is not mandatory in Canada. It cannot be made mandatory because of the Canadian Constitution. Legislation regulations must be interpreted to imply compulsory. Under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, guarantees rights to liberty and security of the person cannot be denied. This gives us autonomy over choices that impact our own physical and psychological integrity. These freedoms are set out in the Charter to ensure that Canadians are free to create and express their ideas, gather to discuss them like we're doing today, and communicate them widely to other people. These activities are basic forms of individual liberty. They are also important to the success of a democratic society in Canada. In a democracy, people must be free to discuss matters of public policy, criticize governments, and offer their own solutions to social problems. They don't want us to criticize. There is simply no rational basis for the infringement of these rights, and it sets a concerning precedent for government to control over Canadians' basic liberties for other reasons in the future. So the bottom line, that vaccine passports would be immoral and a massive government overreach. There is simply no historical parallel for governments attempting to restrict the movements of healthy people over a respiratory virus in this manner. And the speed at which these initiatives are being rushed out should give pause for thought that the rollout is a helter-skelter and filled with the conflicts of interest. Vaccine passports could end up intensifying social divisions whenever they are used. Those who have access to vaccines can return to some semblance of normal life, while those who do not get vaccinated will find themselves left even further out in the cold. These passports can be used as an incentive to change behavior, in which they signal what society expects from individuals. They exemplify a social norm that individuals are expected to comply with. Our federal government recognizes that it cannot legally mandate vaccine passports. It would be unconstitutional, as it would create a two-tier society built on medical discrimination. So, our government is depending on private businesses to push through this measure, which is part of their strategic sabotaging of our constitutional rights. Prudent government, which is now being increasingly promoted, is a discredited ethic that has repeatedly been used to justify horrific human rights abuses. It is based on a mathematical equation that some individuals can be sacrificed for the greater good of the majority. As history has taught us time and again, whenever government rewards themselves with new temporary powers, they usually find it very painfully hard to relinquish them. The same is true for vaccines and vaccine passports, health passes, certificate, or whatever you want to call them. Government totalitarian elements that are trying to oppress us, that are trying to rob us of our liberties, our democracy, our freedom of thought, our freedom of expression, our freedom of assembly, and all the freedoms that give dignity and humanity. Politicians and other elites have made no secret of the fact that they saw the COVID pandemic as their opportunity for the Great Reset, pushing an agenda of centralization and restrictions on freedom that couldn't have been passed in normal circumstances. We oppose the government threatening, imposing, or mandating liberties, restrictions, penalties, or denying benefits to those who refuse or are unable to receive a vaccination. This may be done through the direct implementation of a vaccine passport, or the requirement that any Canadian provide proof of COVID vaccine to access government services, including health care. Vaccine passports are about creating justification for segregation, discrimination, and the elimination of certain groups of people. In this case, people who do want to be part of an experimental vaccine program, which identifies them as non-compliant with top-down edicts. continues is clearly more about imposing top-down government control than actually safeguarding public health. It is absolutely so much more than a vaccine pass. I cannot stress enough that it has the power to turn your life on or off or be marginalized in order for you to engage in society. It is the intent of our government to turn vaccine refusers into social outcasts as a tool to coerce compliance. It's no doubt, it's not about public health. It's about creating loyal subjects. People who are literally willing to sacrifice their life and the life of their children at the request of the government, with no questions asked. The last step will entail persecution of non-vaccinated individuals. What really matters now is that a significant number of our population is no longer willing to put up with the assault on our freedom. We must shed our imaginary fears, reject media fear-mongering, insist on freedom of speech, and engage in the democratic process. The most obvious answer is to take a firm stand against the transfer of power into cold-bloodedness, regardless of whether you think COVID vaccines are a good idea or not. Mass protests can end vaccine passports. Peaceful protest and legislative action are the remedy. A petition has been created for No Scotia Pass. This is one more step in our efforts to keep our freedom, charter, and constitution, as well as our human rights alive. Basically, we have to use the law to save the law. Remember this. They don't care about us. Their only interest is serving their interests and pushing forward their own agendas. Just look at how excited the globalist institutions like the World Economic Forum have become, calling the pandemic an opportunity to force through their Great Reset agenda. These ghouls are not the type of people the public wants in charge of micromanaging their lives. Thus, it is left up to the individual to protect themselves how they see fit. The establishment tells us we are not capable of doing that. Rather, we must defer their better judgment. They are supposedly smarter than all of us, and as benevolent technocrats, only they have knowledge and righteousness to determine the course of every living person's future. It is therefore imperative, above all else, that the vaccine passport never allowed to take root. The program must be stopped and destroyed. In closing, I'd like to say to all of you, I, Darlene LeBlanc, pledge to you, I will go down dying with my boots on, fighting side by side with all of you to make sure that we return these rights and preserve them for our children.
Listen to her. I'm willing to go to the hill. We're willing to go to this hill and die on it. Because if you want to die from a vaccine, you should die for your freedom.
Is it? Let's. Oh, we're 13 minutes.
I know what Darlene is saying.